Now, the radical phase of the revolution took place in the context of war, first with Austria and Prussia, and then subsequently with Great Britain and Spain, Portugal, and other European powers. And so France was really beleaguered during this time. And this, by the way, I think is one of the reasons that the Committee of Public Safety comes to the fore, and in this climate of emergency, the French more or less accept this kind of restricted control of 12 men on the Committee of Public Safety that ruled. And interestingly, the French Legislative Assembly itself had declared war with Austria in April 1792. So it was actually the French that started this war. But it was Austria and its ally Prussia that took the offensive and invaded France. On September 20th, 1792, however, a French Revolutionary Army turned back these Prussian and Austrian armies. The battle itself was minor, mostly a French bombardment of the Prussians and Austrians, but the significance was enormous. For the first time, an army composed of men inspired by an identification with their country had defeated an old style professional army based mostly on the discipline imposed by monarchs. Now let's take a closer look at this revolutionary spirit. Its classic expression was the levee en masse, announced by the Committee of Public Safety the following year in August of 1793. And sort of every military historian sort of knows about the levee en masse, and it's just glorious in terms of its rhetoric. From this moment, it says, until that in which the enemy shall have been driven from the soil of the Republic, all Frenchmen are in permanent requisition for the service of the armies. The young men shall go into battle. The married men shall forge arms and transport provisions. The women shall make tents and clothing and shall serve in the hospitals. The children shall turn old linen into lint. The aged shall betake themselves to the public places in order to arouse the courage of the warriors and the unity of the Republic. This is awesome. Now, the levee en masse was a military expression of nationalism. And until the French Revolution, see, ordinary people had regarded war as something akin to a natural disaster. They themselves had no stake in the conflict. It was all about what the king wanted to do, what the nobility wanted to do. It had nothing to do with their own aspirations. When the army came in, you're dealing with with people who were volunteering, maybe out of economic necessity, or were conscripted for long periods of time, which was kind of a personal and family disaster. And so the French Revolution, changes the equation here because it creates a new ideology called nationalism. And the people now identified strongly with the nation state, so that when a nation state went to war, and nationalism quickly becomes much broader than just France. I'm talking about nation states in general. When nation states went to war, they generally did so with the enthusiastic support of the people. Until 1793, the revolutionary government had relied upon volunteers to man the army and began a program of conscription, a military draft. Now, at first glance, this sounds no different than the practice of the monarchs, who also forced men into service, but there is a key difference. The revolutionaries did so in the name of the French people and in defense of the revolutionary ideals of liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, and brotherhood. And this gave their conscription orders legitimacy in the eyes of most Frenchmen, not all, but most. And now legitimacy is an important concept because most people will willingly understand and obey instructions they receive from an authority that they regard as having the moral right to govern them. In most localities, men accepted conscription orders readily, although, as I say, in a few areas they resisted so strongly as to revolt against the revolutionary government. Let's take a closer look at nationalism. There are many definitions of nationalism out there, but I like this one. First, the first component of nationalism is what has been called an imagined community of people, usually based upon a common language, heritage, customs, religion, and so on. But it can also be based upon shared political values. The United States, for instance, is a nation of immigrants, so people who came speaking different languages, having different backgrounds, heritage, and customs, and so forth. But we're all united by certain core beliefs about freedom that are specific to the United States. Other countries believe in freedom as well, but there's a sort of a kind of a specifically American way of looking at liberty and what the good life involves, and so on. The second element of nationalism is a belief that people, not a king or other ruler, are the ultimate source of legitimate authority, so that the people themselves are sovereign. And third is the belief that because the people are the ultimate source of legitimate authority, they should not be governed by outsiders. But rulers of a different ethnic background, are not legitimate or not appropriate. And in Europe, it was common for monarchies to be multi-ethnic. And for instance, Austria, the Austrian Empire, consisted of a variety of ethnicities: Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, Ruthenians, Serbs, and so forth. But the emperor was a German speaker, that background. That was common in Europe, but nationalism argued against this idea. And in the 20th century, this aspect of nationalism would become very important. And then finally, the idea that the nation state serves a moral purpose in history. And the United States has this idea of spreading democracy the world over, and sort of being the arsenal democracy, as they called itself during World War II. Other countries have see themselves as serving a moral purpose in history. The French revolutionaries saw themselves as spreading the ideals of liberty, equality, brotherhood to the rest of Europe, that they were in effect fighting wars of liberation. And as you can see on the map, over time, the French armies did very well. By 1799, they had annexed, occupied, or otherwise controlled much of present-day Belgium, Holland, Switzerland, and Italy. Now, the most gifted of the French revolutionary generals was, of course, Napoleon Bonaparte. He was a soldier his entire life. He was born in 1769 to a minor noble family on the island of Corsica, which has only recently been annexed, and made part of France. And at age 9, he entered a military academy. 6 years later, he transferred to the École Militaire, the military school in Paris, and a year after that became the second lieutenant of artillery. Now, when the French Revolution began, he was just shy of his 20th birthday. Now, only because he came from a noble family did he become an officer in the first place. And because it was a minor noble family from Corsica, not metropolitan France, he certainly would not have gained high rank but for the revolution. Because the French had an important advantage, military advantage, that flowed from the values of the revolution. It came from an aspect of equality, called the career open to talent. And Napoleon is an example of this, but so were many of his high-ranking officers in the Grande Armée that he eventually created. Um, Former sergeants, for example, who became generals and indeed, in some cases, field marshals, um, and who would have been barred from officership when it was restricted to those of noble birth. So, you know, other European powers had officers, that came from the nobility, and some of them were good at their jobs, and some of them sucked at their jobs. But because of the career open to talent, um, those with the most military ability rose in rank and responsibility to a degree that other European powers could not match, and this included Napoleon himself. Now, Napoleon inherited both the military reforms and military advantages that flowed from this nationalistic spirit and from the values of the revolution. And much of his military genius lay in his ability to exploit those reforms and advantages to the fullest. Napoleon's art of war rested upon four foundations. The first were the results of impressive military reforms um, before the French Revolution, between the 7 Years' War and the revolution, which began in 1789. That's number one. Number two is the nationalistic spirit created by the revolution itself. Third was the career open to talent. And then finally was Napoleon's own military genius. The military reforms that I talked about, just now mentioned, are really beyond the scope of a survey course like this, but the other three are crucial. And again, nationalism, the career open to talent, and Napoleon's military genius. Now, chief among these advantages that French revolutionary armies had was their ability to forage, to live off the countryside when necessary. European armies under what's called the Ancien Regime, or the old regime, the armies of the monarchs of Europe, dared not do this, dared not live off the countryside. Because effectively living off the countryside, or effective foraging is the term of art for this, effective foraging required large numbers of soldiers to detach in small numbers, to scurry around the countryside to find and bring back foodstuffs and forage for horses and so on. And this meant freeing them temporarily from the discipline of their officers, which in turn, in the Ancien Regime, would have made it easy for these soldiers to desert. So Ancien Regime officers didn't, Ancien Regime armies didn't dare do this kind of thing, which confined them to regular lines of supply. The French Revolutionary armies and the Army of Napoleon, on the other hand, had much greater flexibility because they could live off the countryside when necessary. And so, and this advantage was due to soldiers fired with revolutionary ardor and with a belief that they had a personal stake in the cause. And so these men go off, forage for goods and so forth, and then reliably return to the ranks. And again, this gave the revolutionary armies a speed and a flexibility that other European armies could not match. Now, for over a decade, Napoleon won one victory after another, defeating Austria, Prussia, Russia, Spain, and other lesser European powers. And through one masterstroke after another, he created an empire that rivaled that of Charlemagne 1,000 years before. And this map shows the French Empire at its height on the eve of the invasion of Russia in June 1812. Yet just 2 years after this high watermark of French power, Napoleon would be defeated and forced to abdicate as emperor. Well, what went wrong? First, although Napoleon defeated Austria, Prussia, Russia, and other countries, it could not defeat Great Britain, uh, which, after all, was an island off the coast of the continent, um, and and therefore, very difficult for Napoleon to get at. The wealth of Great Britain enabled it to help to finance Napoleon's adversaries, and its naval power eventually swept the French fleet from the seas. And this happened most importantly at the Battle of Trafalgar in October 1805, when uh, British British Navy under the command of Lord Nelson, Admiral Horatio Nelson, defeated actually not just the French fleet, but the Spanish fleet that Napoleon controlled by that time. So it's really one of the great naval victories of history, and it ended for all time any threat of invasion by Napoleon of Great Britain, something that he really wanted to do, but found difficult even when he had naval power, and of course impossible when he no longer did. So that's the first reason that Napoleon eventually failed. Second, in Spain, there was a people's war, a partisan war against French occupation that proved impossible to quell, and was, by the way, supported by Great Britain and an army under the Duke of Wellington. And this Spanish ulcer, as Napoleon called it, sucked thousands upon thousands of Napoleon's troops into a war that continued year after year, despite severe French measures against Spanish partisans or freedom fighters, as shown here. Third, in June 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia with 600,000 men, huge army for that time. And although his army got all the way to Moscow, capturing it in September of 1812, the Russians did not concede defeat. Napoleon's armies were unable to supply themselves adequately during the coming Russian winter, and became too reduced in numbers to continue their offensive against Russia. And so ultimately, Napoleon was forced to retreat. And in that retreat, he lost thousands of men, some to disease, some to frostbite and the freezing cold of the Russian winter, and then some were taken prisoners by the pursuing Russian armies. Napoleon never recovered from this disaster. And then finally, despite Napoleon's many victories, he was never able to create a lasting peace settlement, because the countries that he defeated did not remain defeated for long. As soon as they had an opportunity to get back into the fray, they did, because everybody just considered to be Napoleon too much of a threat and too intent upon controlling Europe economically, if in no other way, and sort of dominating Europe. And so, because Napoleon was so clearly that kind of ongoing threat, European powers, Austria, Prussia, and others, when they had the opportunity to go to war against Napoleon again, they did so. And in October 1813, the combined armies of Austria, Prussia, Russia, and certain lesser European states defeated Napoleon in the Battle of Leipzig, also called the Battle of the Nations. In April 1814, Napoleon, after conducting actually a pretty good fighting retreat into France, Napoleon was forced to abdicate. And because he was a head of state, the European victors did not want to create the precedent of, for instance, executing him because he was a head of state, and they did not want to strip him completely of the power that one associates with nation, with heads of state. But they did want him out of the way. And so he was sent into a comfortable exile on the island of Elba, which is off the coast of Italy. And there he was installed in this palatial villa and was expected to live there on Elba, which he was allowed to control. And he had a teeny tiny army and so forth. And he could, and so it was just like, he could live in sort of an elegant retirement, comparable to that of heads of state. The Allies now installed a relative of the executed King Louis XVI as King of France. But this new French king was unpopular, and Napoleon saw an opportunity. And in March 1815, daringly returned to France. A French force was sent by the king to arrest Napoleon, who had just a very small number of followers and just a very, very small contingent of troops, just a few dozen. But Napoleon calculated on the probability that any French forces sent to arrest him, they consisted of veterans of his old Grand Army. He felt that he could count on their loyalty and love for him, and he was right. This French force that was sent to arrest Napoleon instead went over to Napoleon's side. And everywhere he went, as he moved toward Paris, additional military units came over to Napoleon. The population basically greeted Napoleon in a positive kind of way, and he soon reinstalled himself as emperor. Now, naturally, his European rivals went to war to stop him. And this time, they did not regard him as a head of state. They regarded him as an outlaw, and they said so outright. Those were the conditions under which Napoleon now found himself having to fight. Napoleon's only chance for victory lay in defeating the Allied armies one at a time before they could converge upon France. And so in late May and early June of 1815, he launched an offensive against the Prussian army in present-day Belgium, defeated it, and then went on to attack a nearby British army. But in this climactic Battle of Waterloo against the British army, shown here, the British held on under the command of the Duke of Wellington. And in the evening, the supposedly beaten Prussian army unexpectedly appeared on the battlefield, attacked Napoleon, and inflicted a decisive defeat. Napoleon was again sent into exile, this time on the lonely island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, off the coast of Africa and thousands of miles from Europe. This is the sketch of the British naval officers taking him into exile. There on St. Helena, Napoleon lived out the rest of his days. He died in 1821. He was just 51 years old. Just 51 years old when he passed away. Here is the tomb of Napoleon Bonaparte. After he died, years after he died, his remains were brought to Paris and placed in this imposing tomb. And you can go there now and visit. It is in what's called the Hotel des Invalides in Paris, and this was a sort of a retirement home for French veterans. And so there's Napoleon. He is, of course, considered to be one of the great military commanders in all history. His name is synonymous with military genius. But it is important to bear in mind that without the French Revolution, without the ideals of liberty, equality, and brotherhood that fired the revolutionaries and also the revolutionary armies that became Napoleon's armies, Napoleon would never have enjoyed the kind of success that he did, and would not even have had the opportunity to achieve a high military rank, uh, because he simply did not come from a sufficiently aristocratic family. But because of the career open to talent that the French Revolution made possible, it made possible his rise to power, political power, and also to military power. Last thing to say about the French Revolution is historians think of 1789, the year that the French Revolution began, as the demarcation between early modern European history and modern European history. And the ideals of the French Revolution permeated the world over. And the ideology of nationalism became the most important ideology of the 19th century and on into the 20th century, and it remains important in the 21st century as well. The French Revolution is really one of the most compelling events in world history.